the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you're answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
For having me. Always a pleasure to get to chat with the students at Stevens. While I'm not physically back there right now, virtually, it's very satisfying. So just give me some cues here. I'm going to advance the slides, but if they don't advance, and just give me some kind of wave me off or something. All right. Okay.
It advanced.
Perfect. Yeah. So, and by the way, I should have you do all my introductions. Nobody's ever said so many nice things about me in a 1-minute span. But as Dib said, I'm currently the sustainability reporting and data analytics manager at Public Service. Previously, I held roles with NRG, Direct Energy, Hess, and ADP. What I will say is this: when given the opportunity to pick a topic to talk to the students about, I picked waste management intentionally. My background is certainly more in energy supply and in IT, but one of the things I've come to appreciate is how important this topic is for sustainability. And in addition to anyone who endeavors to have a career in sustainability, this is just good things to know about life. And there's, once you're aware of how much waste is around us and how complex it is to manage, this is something that you look at the world very differently. So I was excited to get this chance to chat about this. All right, so I just want to give a little overview. I'm going to certainly cover this at a high level. I'll get into why managing waste is important, why it's important as a sustainability topic, and then really how the discipline has evolved over the years and how it's changed really from, let's say, in the 1980s when waste management was more about just reduction and treatment, try and use less, and when you throw it out, just don't flush it down the drain, to really some more elaborate methodologies today with the EPA's waste management hierarchy, sustainable materials management, and the circular economy. I'm going to land this plane and then I'm going to pivot into the role of reporting standards and why sustainability is important, not just from a EPA and environmental perspective, but why it's an important topic among corporations, among organizations, right? And kind of give you the full picture there. And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about our award-winning waste management program at Public Service. So I'll give you a little bit of overview on that. I hope, and Dibs and Parisa, we'll have time for questions at the end?
Yes, we'll have time for questions. And then, if they have more questions, you have that breakout room thing with them.
Perfect. All right, so rolling along here. So just a little bit of a breakdown of what is waste. And it seems kind of obvious, right? Unlike a lot of environmental impacts that you can't see, right? You can't see greenhouse gas emissions. You can't see something that's in the ground. You can see waste and you can smell waste and you are aware of it all around you. GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, defines waste as just anything that the holder discards or intends to discard. Importantly, it is generated by an organization's activities. So if you go to the cafeteria and they are intending to serve you a meal, they are going to be generating waste, whether it's in the form of cooking oil, whether it's in the form of packaging during that intended activity. And this is also important. It can be generated from I'll say from a waste management and from a forensic standpoint, both upstream and downstream in your value chain. So while we're all carrying around some kind of smartphone with us, right, whether it's an iPhone or whether it's an Android device, the raw materials for that phone were extracted, they were shipped, they were manufactured, and all throughout that value chain, right, upstream to make that phone, there was waste generated. So it's a really big topic. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus in on corporate waste, like public service, and I'm going to focus in on organizational waste, like Stevens and educational institutions. All right, so you can't get too far into this without covering waste streams. Simply put, waste streams are the flow of waste from its source to its end. They're important to identify because you have to proactively manage really their negative impacts. Very rarely does waste get produced and it just has a positive impact. They tend to be common across industries. So all pharmaceutical companies tend to have common waste streams. All utilities tend to have common waste streams. All minerals extraction firms tend to have common waste streams. It's not a one-for-one, but you'll see commonalities. I've highlighted a couple examples to try and ground this discussion. So we're all aware of municipal solid waste. This is your everyday garbage. It's mostly just carted away, thrown in the trash receptacle. We have, in a lot of cases, sorting operations that are provided to us by municipal waste haulers. I put a bullet here. Municipal solid waste hauling tends to get more and more expensive over time. I'm not going to get into the economics of hauling away municipal solid waste, but it's not cheap. E-waste, it's a really important subcategory of municipal solid waste. It's all your unwanted electronics, computers, phones, televisions, and it is the fastest growing waste stream in the country. Food waste, which is another important subcategory of municipal solid waste. This is both excess food and unused food and food byproducts. The reason why this is a particularly important subcategory is that you can get a high intensity of methane emissions as food decomposes without oxygen, which is exactly what happens in a landfill. So you take your banana peel, you throw your banana peel in the garbage, somebody comes by, they pick up the garbage, they haul the garbage to a landfill, it gets packed down, and then all of a sudden, that banana peel will start to decompose via a process called anaerobic digestion. And when that happens, you get methane emissions, which are, depending on what source you're looking at and what vintage, on average 26 times more potent to the atmosphere than, say, carbon dioxide emissions. And then I wanted to just call this out. We're not going to get too much into it. You also have hazardous waste streams. These are waste streams that are harmful to human health. They require special handling. They tend to be strictly regulated. There's all different kinds of hazardous waste streams. And in fact, in New Jersey, every county tends to have some operation where residents can go. So like right up in Hudson County where Stevens is, there's a recycling treatment center in Kearney. If you go to their website, the Hudson County Improvement Authority, there's a whole list of hazardous waste you can bring there and drop it off. It's, it's motor oils, it's pesticides, it's things of that nature. Important to note, these are things that you don't just want to go outside and dump them right on the front lawn of Stevens University. It would be bad if these things leached into the soil. We're not going to get into hazardous waste too much, but I did want to call it out as being something important and just to be aware of. There's other important waste streams we're not going to cover. Construction debris, farm and livestock have their kind of own variety of waste streams, right? It tends to be very organic. Plastics is a very important waste stream. It's about 12% of MSW today, and it has a habit of ending up in the ocean. it's important to understand waste streams so that you can essentially start to evaluate them and manage them. And that's really the takeaway from this so far. Okay. So just a little bit of numbers here. If you look at the municipal solid waste generated in the United States, it's a continuously increasing trend. So back in 1960, there was about 80 million tons of municipal solid waste that was produced in the United States. You can see every decade on this chart, it increases. It kind of looks like it started to level off in 2010. And then you can see in 2018, which is the latest data that's reported by the EPA, you see it increasing again. The UN Environment Program expects the municipal solid waste picture to continue to escalate and increase somewhere by 50 to 70% by 2050. The point here is that this is an increasing problem that is not going to go away. And waste will continue to need to be managed by every corporation, every organization, and really every entity that generates it. All right. So a lot of background information on what waste is, and I hope I've grounded the conversation successfully. However, I want everybody to be able to go back and talk to their friends about why this is important. So 5 big reasons why managing waste is important. Some of them obvious, some less so. First and foremost, environmental protection. It's always going to be easier, cheaper, and faster to just discard waste in the environment. So if you take certain waste streams and you just throw them out, and right, even with all the laws we have today, there's always going to be bad actors who degrade the environment. It's important to protect just the natural environment from hazardous waste and from, generally speaking, all waste from just being distributed everywhere. Second piece of this, which is less obvious, it's expensive to manage waste. So if you can get really good at managing your waste streams and treating your waste, it can actually become a competitive advantage and just reduce your operational costs as a business. Every metric ton of waste that has to be treated and discarded and hauled away has to be paid for. It gets paid for via fees at Stevens. It gets paid for via when you go buy product. And so if you can reduce the cost of waste and ultimately reduce the amount of waste you generated, it is certainly a competitive edge. Public health and safety. I don't want to get too deep in this. This is not an environmental law webinar, and I would not proclaim myself to be an expert of environmental law. But if you want to go down the chat GPT rabbit hole of like Superfund in this country, it's an interesting history. Back in the 60s, there was a lot of harmful waste that got just basically discarded in places like Love Canal, New York, which is up by Niagara Falls, in places like the Valley of Drums out in Kentucky. And in the 80s, there was historic legislation that the Congress passed to start cleaning these sites up. So really important. There was a general recognition that protecting the public health and the greater safety of the public was critical, which is how we got into a lot of the laws we have today around regulation of hazardous waste disposal. What I would say today, we usually are confronted by this via accidents, right? You see cases where there's a train derailment and all of a sudden there's a hazardous material that is accidentally spilled, and those things tend to be cleaned up and remediated. But certainly from just a waste management standpoint, right, the public health and safety it's always going to be high stakes from that perspective. The last couple here, resource conservation. We have a limited amount of raw materials in the world. I don't know how much more raw material is left of every type, but I can tell you that someday, whether it's 1,000,000 years from now or 1,000 years from now, the raw material fuel gauge will go to empty. And so the idea here is if you can take waste and you can, instead of discarding it, turn it into an input for something else, or you can just use less as you make something, right, and design to use less, you can conserve those resources. And whether they become fully sustainable or just extend the life of resources, right? There's an important element there. And then the last piece of this, and this is more of a recent trend, you certainly have seen new and innovative techniques to turn waste into viable products. This is an overhead shot of a renewable natural gas waste digester. I'll get into a couple other examples before we end the webinar today. But suffice to say, right now there is new investment in new technology that is literally turning one entity's trash into a treasure. Okay, so pivoting here a little bit, waste management as a sustainability topic. So we know what waste is, we know why it's important. This picture on the left really lands why it's important as a sustainability topic. I know everybody on this webinar is already a sustainability expert, so I won't dive too deep into what double materiality is, but simply put, when it comes to an organization, whether it's a public service or whether it is a Stevens Institute, there's two different types of materiality for sustainability topics as a practice. The first is financial materiality. So how does the topic impact the entity's finances and long-term financial condition? And the second is impact materiality, or how does the topic impact the greater people and planet and the environment and things of that nature. Waste management tends to vary across industries. It's not financially material to every industry. And really, it tends to have financial materiality based on the degree of how negative the impact is or how much waste you're generating. From a double materiality perspective, right? So if we're talking about just people and the environment, it tends to be a very material topic that every single entity has to address. I was thinking of this analogy before the call or before the webinar. If you think of Stevens Institute as the entire universe, right? Waste management as a topic is more material in different parts of that universe. I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying waste management in the cafeteria or in the dining halls is certainly more material than waste management in the classroom. That's not to say that waste management in the lecture halls and classrooms isn't important. I'm sure there's a recycling bin. I'm sure we don't just discard our waste everywhere. But when you're in a food situation, there's food separation, right? And separation of waste streams. You're generating food waste, which, as we covered in the beginning, is a very potent waste stream from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. And that analogy kind of fits with financial materiality of waste streams across the board. Waste, and I'll cover it before the end, but waste management tends to be financially material to very specific industries. And there are standard bearers that help identify that. Okay. So I kind of let off with this. When I was younger in the 80s, waste management was about just not discarding your trash everywhere, using less, and certainly if you had something dangerous, try and get treatment for it. And more recently, and what I would say recently, somewhere in the past 10 to 15 years, there's been newer trends emerging. And I'm going to go through these one at a time, but certainly the EPA has done a lot of work in developing the waste management hierarchy, which has led to the sustainable materials management practice. And then we've even evolved further to the circular economy. So I want to hit on these one by one because I think they're all important concepts in their own right. The waste management hierarchy is really just table stakes for this discussion. The EPA developed this for non-hazardous waste, and it really ranks waste management strategies from what they would consider most preferred to least preferred based on environmental impact. This is really just nuts and bolts stuff. This is like when you go back and when you go home for break and you talk to your family, you can tell them you know all the details about composting, but you really have to know this stuff. So from the top to the bottom, right, most preferred to least preferred. Source reduction and reuse, just basic. Can we reduce waste generation at the source? When we're making iPhones, can we make it by less waste somewhere in the value chain? When we are about to discard waste, can we, instead of discarding it, just use it somewhere else, right? If we can't do that, the next preferred strategy is recycling and composting. I think we all know what recycling is at this point. We don't have a terribly high success rate in this country with recycling. Different topic for a different day. What I would say is, from a strategy standpoint, if you can not only recycle materials into a new process, but from a business perspective, and this is where I was talking about the competitive advantage before, if you can recycle equipment, extend the life of equipment as opposed to buying new equipment, that plays in here, as you don't have to extract materials, manufacture materials, throw out old materials, right? So there is a net gain there. They lump composting in with this, which is important. Composting, which is really, it's the collection of organic, like food waste. And what it does is, the idea is to let that compost stack decompose naturally with oxygen. It returns nutrients to soil. It certainly releases carbon dioxide. But the benefit of composting is simple. You don't pack food waste in a landfill, which packing it in a landfill results in methane. Methane is worse than carbon dioxide. If you want to take anything away from this, from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, methane worse than carbon dioxide. So composting helps with that. Newer processes and technologies, and there's been really big advancements in energy recovery. The idea here is, we have waste, we have matter. Can we turn it into heat? And if you can make heat, you can make electricity, basically. You can look at history. This is not a new idea. The idea of burning garbage to make electricity has been going on for a really long time. What's advanced is we've gotten a lot better at it. We've gotten, when you hear, there's elements here of energy recovery that are important. When you hear about things like renewable natural gas, the idea is taking organic excrement off of a livestock farm, and instead of having it just decompose into carbon dioxide, putting it into a digester, and then taking that, even if it's kind of like a wet biogas, right, and not a pure methane, burning it on site and using that for electricity on farm, right? And it's, in the hierarchy of things preferred, yes, it's not as good as just simply reducing waste, but it's better than just letting natural decomposition happen and just, right, the release of carbon dioxide. And then finally, the last piece of this, treatment and disposal. If all else fails, just don't flush it down the drain, right? If you have a piece of garbage, don't throw it out the window. Don't flush it down the drain. Find where you have to, take it down to the Hudson County Improvement Authority and dispose of it the right way. This is table stakes. Everything else that happened after 2010 started with this. All right, moving on a little bit here. So, sustainable materials management. This is a really big topic. There's been a lot of research done on this. What I would say is that it is a systematic approach to look at every piece of the product life cycle for opportunities to reduce waste. I know this is a small picture, so I'll just read the cycle, the piece of the cycle off, but from materials extraction to manufacturing to distribution to using the product to disposing the product, are there pieces in the life cycle where we can reduce waste generated? EPA did a lot of work on this. They really, this is me speak. This is not like you're going to go to their website and see that they said this, but they've honed this to the point where they have focus areas that are designed around best practices and also biggest impact. So when you talk about their focus areas of food management, the built environment, plastics and packaging, and electronics and batteries, these are areas that produce a lot of waste, where there's opportunity for sustainable materials management. When we talked about food management before, right, just separating food and composting, or separating food into a waste stream that doesn't get landfilled, right? Big gain there. plastics and packaging, right? Not landfilling this, not letting it end up in the ocean. There's similar gains to be made in the built environment just because of the volume of construction debris and the volume of manufacturing waste. And so the idea here is you're looking for impacts throughout the entire life cycle to try and reduce waste. One of the big kind of advances here in thinking was that some stages of the product life cycle are more problematic than others. When you think about some really small products, like I had talked about, like the iPhone in the beginning, your iPhone is a relatively small piece of equipment. And if you can reduce waste upstream in the raw materials extraction and in the manufacturing process, that may be where the larger gains are to be had versus just, the simple. I'm not saying disposing your iPhone properly isn't important, but there could be larger gains in the life cycle, and that's really what they're gaining at here. And then really the final evolution of this is the circular economy. This idea of the circular economy is that you're trying to design closed loop products. You are trying to design a product where essentially the final, the final waste product can be used as a raw material and an input to the next product, where the design is such that it is minimizing as much residual waste as possible. And it's got a full end-to-end reduction of waste. It's got the appropriate collection streams so that it can recover these and feed them back in. I have a couple of really good examples of this that I'll get into in a couple of slides. The idea here is that you're reducing GHG emissions and environmental impacts that result from extracting and processing materials because you're doing this completely closed loop. You're conserving raw materials and trying to really be not just extend the lifetime of them, but ultimately make them sustainable and in theory, forever. Okay. All right. I want to pivot a little bit to the role of reporting standards. So reporting standards are important because there's a big demand for organizations to report on how they're managing any sustainability topic, including waste. The frameworks and standards play a key role because they allow us to create transparent, comparable disclosures across organizations. I've listed out 3 on this slide. These are not the only 3. GRI, or the Global Reporting Initiative, they tend to be the standard bearer for double materiality disclosures. So GRI has a whole process that if companies want to disclose in alignment with the GRI standard, you have to go through and understand your material impacts, how severe they are, whether they meet the threshold for being materially impactful to people, planet, the environment, and your finances, and then disclosing based in a very standard way based on each topic. I will tell you that they also have sector standards for what they believe to be particularly impactful sectors, right? Like mining and extraction. Most industries, though, if you're disclosing in alignment with GRI, you're going to disclose your waste, right? Even if it's not financially impactful. SASB, on the other hand, or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards, they specifically produce a standard that hones in on financially impactful or financially material topics. So, for example, in my industry or the utility industry, waste management is not a financially material topic. It is financially material in other industries like, waste management and hauling, materials and mining, iron and steel production, building products. Those are industries where SASB specifically says you should disclose this because this is financially material to your firm. And they have a whole materiality finder where you can look up by industry what the financially material topics are, and figure out if you should be disclosing them to, to your investors, to the greater community, to nonprofits and other organizations that are interested in these things. And the last piece of this, and I put this in here, the UN came up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are very broad, and it's a far-reaching framework. But there are 3 of these in particular that deal with sustainable waste management. So as an organization, if you want to disclose in alignment with the UN SDGs, and you're going to cover waste management in SDGs 6, 11, and 12, which are clean water and sanitation, sustainable cities and communities, and then responsible consumption and production. Okay. So some examples in action, and I hope this really kind of ties it all up and brings it home. So I have some prominent examples of waste management strategies in action. The first one that I've listed out here is the use of electric arc furnaces in the steel industries. I got to work the steel industry for a little bit earlier in my career. And if anyone's really interested in this, Steel Dynamics, who is a steel manufacturer, I think their headquarters is down in Texas now, but they utilize electric arc furnace technology. It is a circular process. And so they take 82% recycled steel, they put it into an electric furnace. That electric furnace, if you look at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, produces about 1/3 of the emissions as a traditional blast furnace. If you are not a steel manufacturing expert, traditionally you'd have these enormous blast furnaces that you would just like literally blast heat at for, in some cases, I think it takes weeks to heat them up, and you would like smelt down iron ore into steel and manufacture it that way. These are incredibly efficient. These electric arc furnaces can take recycled product. And it's an innovative example of a circular economy in action. Second example, and this is a sustainable materials management example, anaerobic digesters in agricultural, food waste, and livestock industries. I talked about this a little bit already. This is a relatively new trend, primarily inspired by some of the clean fuel standards in places like California, Washington, and Oregon, where those jurisdictions looked at transportation greenhouse gas emissions and said, well, geez, if we could use, instead of a fossil fuel, if we could pivot to certain renewable fuels, one of them being renewable natural gas, right, we could curtail our transportation emissions. And so you started to see these like digesters pop up all over the country. And it's a really complex process, and I am minimizing like 99% of the complexity. But essentially, natural gas engines they exist. So having a natural gas transportation driven vehicle is not new. What is new, though, is that instead of taking like fossil natural gas, which is 94% methane, you can put it through this anaerobic digestion process, get a molecule that's equivalent, and essentially, because of the pipeline infrastructure that we have in this country, you could ship this natural gas wherever it needs to get to. And it has a much lower life cycle emissions profile, because instead of just leaving, right, this agricultural and livestock waste, in a field to naturally decompose, or you're taking that out of the equation, and you are producing a fuel that is going to be shipped. It's going to be used for transportation. It's going to prevent the need to mine and extract additional fossil fuels. So, and like I said, that's a relatively newer innovation, but pretty cool stuff. And then the last piece here I wanted to kind of shout out. In the plastics industry, there's a tremendous amount of effort going into reducing the amount of plastic that goes into packaging up front, and then reusing plastic. Plastic is really hard to eliminate. The idea of getting away from the take, make, and waste model for plastic, and kind of that linear waste management approach. And the idea here is every piece of plastic that you take out of the equation and reuse, it takes a lot of fossil fuel to make plastic. It fills up landfills. It never goes away. And so you could reduce ocean plastic pollution by 80%. You can reduce emissions by 25%. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation does a lot of work on this. I'll say it this way. I don't endorse individual foundations, but they have a lot of good material on plastics and circular economy, and I would encourage everyone just to look at that for the value of the materials. Okay, last slide. I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about my own waste management program at Public Service. So we have developed an award-winning waste management program. We're a multi-year recipient of the New Jersey DEP Recycling Champion Award. At Public Service, we recycle historically between 85 to 90% of our solid waste, which far exceeds the US EPA national recycling goal of 50%. We reuse materials wherever possible. It's key to our waste minimization strategy. I have a picture here. This is a picture of our reusing our timber wetland mats, which when we're doing work on our distribution and transmission grid, right, there's heavy equipment. We drive it over those mats, and we reuse about 2,500 tons annually. So that's significant. And we incorporate investment recovery into all of our sustainability practices. We are trying to reduce our solid waste creation. We are trying to reduce our environmental footprint. And as I said, there's a cost reduction benefit to doing this as well. So anytime we can recover and reuse equipment as opposed to buying new equipment, that has tangible long-term impacts to keeping our operation and maintenance low and also reducing our environmental footprint. We did put out a waste management report last year. I encourage everyone to look that up. I know that I'm displaying a link on the screen that you can't actually click. However, if you just go to the Google machine and type in Public Service 2025 Waste Management Update, I promise you'll find it. So that is all the slides I brought today. I am happy to take questions.